Have you ever sat down at a commander table and suddenly 3 hours have passed and you're no closer to ending the game than when you started? Introducing the Mono-Red $100 challenge. The rules are pretty simple. The deck has to be less than $100, it has to be mono-red, basic lands don't count toward the cost, and you have to use the lowest listing price for each card. That's pretty much it. There's an underlying rule here that we're building jank, but since that's so subjective, it's hard to include it as a quote-unquote rule. When brewing a mono-red deck, it's helpful to know the 6 primary archetypes available within the color. There's Typal, primarily goblins, burn, treasure, spellslinger, artifacts, and equipment. There are certainly other archetypes worth exploring, but if we're talking about the things mono-red does particularly well and particularly often, these are usually what we see near the top of usage data. Being the avid token enjoyer I am, I figured the Goblin clans were a good place to start, and I set out to find my commander. I initially started building this deck around the GOAT himself, Krenko Mob Boss, as the commander for this deck. I mean, come on, he's obviously the best choice for the deck. Krenko is the highest ranked monocolor card on EDH Rec at number 8. Kenrith the Returned King doesn't count, making the Mob Kingpin the perfect choice for this deck. Except there's a problem. Krenko Mob Boss is just too strong. I needed to find a weaker commander that was still fun to play. Enter a super niche, red, bad commander named Pashalik Mons. This little guy is kind of a weird one. He wants a wide board to sacrifice for value, but an aggro goblin strategy wants you to stay wide and put people in lethal range before the deck starts slowing down. I'll admit, it's not necessarily a great pick, but here's the real magic of this deck. Any legendary creature in the deck can be your commander. If you're playing against a more powerful pod, well, just sub in Krenko Mob Boss. Trying to end the game as fast as possible, throw Torbran out front and watch your goblins burn through everything. Maybe you want a consistent 6-drop as your win con. Muxus Goblin Grandee is perfect as the king of your troop. You have so many options for your commander and can always swap out cards for your own personal favorites. Since the commander of this deck doesn't really matter, let's talk about what makes up the rest of this deck. More goblins. The first thing I look at when building a new deck is card draw. It's debatably the most important part of any deck. With red on a budget, consistent options are slim. We'll need to dig into some artifacts and utility lands to make sure we don't run out of steam too quickly. But first, let's take a look at our creatures who provide some kind of card draw. Dark Dweller Oracle has good synergy with Pashalik Mons and our ability to generate tokens to use as sacrifice fodder. If you're stuck with cards in hand that don't do anything for you, Goblin Picker lets you cycle through them to hopefully top deck a solution. And Lord of the Rings gave us some interesting goblin options, but for mono-red specifically, there isn't a better option than Moria Marauder. You'll be surprised how many cards this lets you draw, and it keeps the Goblin Siege engine going. In my eyes, Runvelt Hordemaster counts for half of a card draw, but it comes packaged with a nice Lord Anthem. Think of the value. Do you like gambling? If yes, Goblin Ringleader is your bookie. The odds favor the house, but there's a little over 1% chance you hit 4 for 4. I did the math. Muxus Goblin Grandee, or Mucus as my autocorrect continually fights me for as I work on this script, is a win con by himself. I like to throw him in the commander slot because he's a consistent 6-drop on a deck with an otherwise pretty low mana curve. It's got about a 2.8. Another Lord of the Rings gem, Horn of the Mark, is great in a budget, go-wide creature deck. I like this card because you can split 6 goblins 3 ways and look at the top 15 cards of your deck, potentially drawing 3 creatures. Pretty good for a color that struggles to draw cards, huh? If you hadn't noticed yet, keeping our hand full of goblins is a bit of a theme here. Icon of Ancestry is only going to add to that strategy with a nice anthem effect attached to it. Slate of Ancestry is like pouring gasoline on a brush fire with Krenko in the commander slot. Big Score, Reckless Impulse, and Ren's Resolve are classic red card draw, nothing too special. I'm gonna be honest, this deck probably has too much ramp. Impulsive Pilfer basically just pays for itself when it dies, but since we've got some sacrifice outlets, having a death trigger that gives a treasure doesn't hurt. Speaking of sack outlets, Skirk Prospector allows you to sacrifice as many goblins as you've got to ping someone down with Pashalik Mons while making mana in the process. Goblin Warchief is a workhorse in this deck. Also, Pashalik Mons mentioned, he makes your goblins cost 1 less, gives them all haste, and comes on a hardy 2/2 body. Soul Ring and Arcane Signet are in here for obvious reasons. It's commander, hard not to include them. Glittering Stockpile is here because there's some really jank combos, none of which are particularly lethal, that helps fuel Pashalik Mons' second ability. I like it for the jank factor. Hazoret's Monument is a ramp piece and card draw option, so it couldn't hurt at its price point. Heraldic Banner helps our goblins upgrade those daggers to short swords with the +1/+0 while also serving as a ramp piece. Sometimes you just need to prove a point. Oftentimes, that point is that you can create 37 red mana at instant speed and do absolutely nothing with it. Brightstone Ritual does that. It does that for you. Very similar story with Battleline. Mana Geyser punishes those pesky green players who are constantly ramping out lands with their Lord Windgrace. All three of these cards could probably be cut as they're better in decks that need big amounts of mana like dragons or spellslingers, but remember, sometimes sending a message of what you can do is as good or better than actually doing something. Goblins have a propensity for violence and blowing stuff up. Let's look at what we can blow up your opponent's stuff up with. 2 damage is more than enough. Some would even say it's a lot. Goblin Crater Maker can nuke itself to remove something like an Esper Sentinel or destroy that freshly slammed Eldrazi Titan. Imagine the narrative team trying to explain that one. When you're playing with goblins, you can't be picky. Goblin Chain Whirler doesn't care who's in front of him. Each opponent, creature, and planeswalker they control takes 1 damage. It's not going to destroy any big threats, but it'll wreck tokens, mana dorks, and utility engines alike. It's pretty easy to kill someone off when they least expect it using Hobgoblin Bandit Lord. Do you hate artifacts? Well, Goblin Trashmaster loves them. Throw a goblin into the graveyard to destroy all those ramp rocks your opponents play. The Lord effect is just a nice bonus. It's not explicitly here for targeted removal, but he's not afraid to yell obscenities at a nice elf. Brash Taunter can snag those value engines we keep talking about, and there's not a ton your opponents can do about it. Goblin Charbelcher was a card I sat on and added simply because it seemed fun. It can completely whiff when you top deck a land, or can blow your opponents up in spectacular fashion. Be Krenko. Have 15 goblins on board. Tap Krenko to make 15 more. Swing in. Sacrifice them all after. Win the game. Refuse to elaborate. Goblin Bombardment. There are 2 use cases for last-ditch effort. The first is for when you truly have no options and need to go all in, or for when you want to put someone to 1 HP, sack your whole board, and hit them for substantially more damage than you even needed in the first place. These are the only acceptable options. Lightning Bolt. I like those choose an effect cards. Cathartic Pyre is just a solid option. Chaos Warp. Buy Force helps kill off those mana rocks we talked about earlier. Or, if you're playing against an artifact player, ruin their whole day. Goblin Grenade is here for the memes. It's the 420 Blaze It of Goblin cards. I don't really know what I meant by that, but I'm leaving it in. Finally, Burn at the Stake. I want you to imagine a board state in which Torbran is your commander, and on the battlefield you've got a Fire and Emancipation down, you've got a small Goblin Warband, and cast Burn at the Stake. Yeah. Nice and crispy. This deck runs off of your ability to keep those fragile goblins alive, or make new ones to replace them in an endless, Satisfactory-esque production line. Let me break down how we're making more goblins and buffing them up to some scary lads. Oh my god, I wasn't recording that whole section. Cool. The fastest game of Commander I've ever played was because of Battlecry Goblin. I won in 6 turns, it wasn't close, and I felt like I just cheated. There aren't too many ways to modify a creature in this deck. I should really check to see if there are any at all, but regardless. Goro is cool, and I will play him wherever possible. Real quick fact check. There is at least 1 creature that can modify itself in this deck. Krenko Tin Street Kingpin can get very out of control very quickly with how many Anthems and Lords are in this deck. One of the few cards in this deck I would label consistent, Legion Warboss is good for making sure you're getting at least 1 goblin down each turn. Squee Dubious Monarch does something very similar to Legion Warboss, while also giving us a way to utilize the graveyard. I've already mentioned Krenko Mob Boss enough, but this card is by far the strongest commander option in the deck, and will make your board stronger whenever you have it. If you aren't playing Krenko as your commander, he's really the only thing you should be searching for with Goblin Matron. Siege Gang Commander and his cousin Siege Gang Lieutenant, who I haven't made room for in this deck yet, create goblins and lob them indiscriminately at anything that moves. It's incredibly easy to get 5 counters on Quest for the Goblin Lord. When those 1/1 Goblin tokens become 3/1 Goblin tokens, the game changes real quick. Tokens enter the battlefield with Summoning Sickness, so let's add a Roar of Resistance to give them haste and turn those aforementioned 3/1s into 5/1s. Want to get real crazy? Throw in a Shared Animosity and watch people lose all hope as they realize you're about to swing in for lethal with a bunch of goofy goblins. Finally, Goblin War Party gives you a package to do with as you see fit. Make some tokens, buff your creatures, or just do both. There are plenty of cards in this deck with pumps or anthems attached to them, but I added a few cards that really drive that point home. Starting with Goblin War Driver, this little guy is extremely pesky. I think it's pretty obvious at this point the purpose he serves. Goblin Chieftain is a classic lord. Goblin King is even better. I usually don't play the various landwalk abilities, but playing goblins is about asserting dominance, and that starts with anyone who's also playing the color red. Ogre Battle Driver keeps the rest of your army in line and their eyes on the prize. In my heart of hearts, I could probably play Neheb the Eternal exclusively for the rest of my life. He's not in this deck, but his burning soul is. I didn't know Torbran, Thane of Red Fell existed until I built this deck. I'm relatively new coming back to Magic. Now, I can't imagine leaving him out of an aggro red deck. Nothing like good old Impact Tremors. We're trying to make lots of goblins and we're rewarded with essentially free damage. When Impact Tremors hits the table, it puts a short clock in the game, so expect to get focused if you weren't already. Fiery Emancipation was too expensive for this list until the reprint in Wilds of Eldraine. Spread the good word of Mono-Red as your goblins liberate the battlefield in a blazing inferno. Have a big board? Goblin Warstrike. Now feels like a pretty good time to address the elephant in the room. This deck requires that you're able to build a board. The beauty of playing mono red comes from knowing when to be patient and when to commit to the kill. Don't overextend yourself trying to kill every player early, putting a target on your back, but also recognize that you're the player on an early timer. It's a balancing act, and that's what makes it so fun. There's a few more random inclusions that don't really have a cohesive category I want to chat through. Exuberant Fuseling is TNT on a card. It has the chance to blow up in someone's face, but it can also get sniped and fizzle out. Collector's Vault is probably worth cutting, but it was a super budget inclusion that shored up any concerns I had about card draw. Swiftfoot Boots, the budget version of Lightning Greaves. Actually really useful for Krenko since he's a lightning rod from a removal and usually can't use his ability in the turn he's played. Virtue of Courage is basically a card draw engine, but there may be games where you don't even cast it from exile and instead just use it as a removal piece. Lastly, I have 7 utility lands in this deck. Because basic lands are free in this deck building minigame, I kept as many of those as I could. Number 1, we've got a few artifacts in the deck that we would really like to keep on the battlefield. Buried Ruin helps ensure that's possible and will hit a point where we aren't fully tapping out each turn, so it's totally fine to sack it. Numbers 2 through 5. Desert of the Fervent, Forgotten Cave, Smoldering Crater, and the Autonomous Furnace are a bit counterintuitive since we're trying to play a tempo game and they come in tapped. But I value card draw a lot, and if I have to play a card a turn later as a result, so be it. One more card that lets us use our graveyard as a resource. Mines of Moria is a card I haven't really tested much, but I've always really liked the idea of it since I first saw the card. Number 7. Finally, the last card on this list is War Room, a staple for just about any monocolored deck. I love this card, even though it's a little bit pricey for the $100 price tag on this deck. I originally set out to make this deck under $100. When I finished building it earlier this year, I was successful with I think a price tag of around $97. Now the deck is up around $130 as the price of cards just naturally fluctuates. Let me know what you think of the deck in the comments. I wanted to keep it on theme as much as possible with Goblin cards, so I don't want to hear anything about Purphoros, God of the Forge. 2 more things. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube. A lot of people don't subscribe to YouTube channels, but it really helps, especially when you're starting out with a new channel and trying to build it. I had it included in the original script to try and build this script around a specific meme, so enjoy the only inclusion I have of it at the very end of this video. You see, oh my god.